Hey everyone,
I'm Tim, and I've just finished a 9-month odyssey around Latin America. Now I'm reopening my diaries, and this time I'm bringing you along with me. Week by week, country by country, all the colors, all the craziness, all the food, all the music, and all the splendor. 9 months when each morning was a new adventure. The road was my companion, and Latin America cast its spell on me. This is my Latin America Diaries. Welcome back to Latin America Diaries. On my final morning in Quito, in Ecuador, the host family of the Airbnb where I was staying dropped me at Quito International Airport. After 9 months on the South American continent, it was finally time to move on, leave Ecuador behind, and head into Central America. From Quito, I would be flying to Panama City via Bogota on Avianca, the Colombian airline. When I checked in at Quito Airport, I was asked if I had an onward ticket from Panama elsewhere to another country. And at that point I didn't, because I was planning to travel overland from there onwards to Mexico through Central America. Fortunately, this is a situation that I had been warned about by a friend of mine and fellow travel blogger and vlogger, Andy Romes. He experienced a similar situation when traveling to Central America just prior to when I was there, in fact. And the concern obviously is that people without onward tickets might use Panama as an entry point to Central America to then travel northwards through Mexico to the United States or Canada. I did have a ticket from Cancun booked out to Istanbul at that point. So all I needed to show was that I did in fact intend on leaving Central America eventually. However, I also believe that having an Australian passport was a very big privilege in this case and an advantage, because I can imagine that people with less powerful passports would probably be subject to much greater scrutiny. With that sorted, it was time to board my flight, which I did. I flew onwards to Bogota. I had a couple of hours in Bogota International Airport where my stomach was still not doing too well. I needed to eat something, so I found something cheap and bland that was available there, and then boarded my flight onwards towards Panama. I landed in Panama City late that afternoon. Panama is a fascinating country. It's very small, but it's strategically important. It sits right at the junction between North and South America, making it one of the great crossroads of the Western Hemisphere. It's also a country whose history has been heavily shaped by foreign influence, particularly by the United States and by the canal that bears its name. For such a young country, Panama has had an outsized impact on world history. And so, welcome to Central America. As soon as I stepped off the plane into Panama's International Airport, one thing stood out to me, and that was American brands everywhere. It was impossible to ignore. There were electronics brands, fast food outlets, clothing stores, all things that I recognized from Hollywood movies and American TV shows that I'd watched over the years. And they were all present here in Panama Airport. It felt less like an airport and more like an outlet mall on the outskirts of Dallas or Houston or something. A lot of this reflects the long history of American involvement in Panama's affairs, but also Panama City's location as a strategic aviation hub halfway between North and South America. Eventually I called an Uber and started making my way towards the hostel where I'd be staying in Panama City. On the way into the city, I was chatting with the driver and we started speaking in Spanish, but very quickly he switched the conversation to English, and I was to discover that, like many Panamanians, he had spent a considerable amount of time in the United States working and living there. As we drove into the city, I got my first glimpse of Panama City's skyline. Tower after tower of glass and steel rose above the waterfront. I remarked to the driver that it looked a bit like Dubai, but he immediately corrected me and said Miami. And this is a comparison which you hear time and time again across Latin America and particularly in Panama. In fact, this was the most modern and most expansive, I think, skyline that I had seen in my travels since I'd left Buenos Aires. That was like 3 months prior. Panama City is one of the richest cities in Latin America, and the skyline makes that abundantly clear. Eventually, I arrived at my accommodation, Hostel Mama Llena. It was one of the cheapest places I could find in the city, and it had a great backpacker atmosphere. Travelers from all over the world were coming and going, sharing stories, and planning their next destinations. Its name, in fact, is that of a traditional Panamanian cake, the Mama Llena cake, which we'll talk about a little bit later in this vlog. When I told the immigration official at Panama City Airport that I would be staying there, it earned sort of a bit of a chuckle and a bit of an approving nod as well. This hostel was pretty cool. It had lots of people, it had a really good vibe there. The only thing was that, like many hostels, it kept its costs down by only turning on the air conditioning at nighttime. And that hadn't been a problem in other cities that I had been to, but in Panama City, it is hot, like humid and hot. So I would say it was a good hostel, but if air conditioning throughout the day is important for you, then be aware of that. After months spent crossing the Andes, traveling through high altitude cities and cooler climates, I was suddenly back in the tropics. The heavy air, the humidity, the warmth, the palm trees, everything felt different. And that first night in Panama set the tone for the rest of the journey. South America was behind me and Central America had begun. That evening, my first evening in Central America, I decided that I was going to get my stomach issues sorted out once and for all. So I went to a small clinic down the road from the hostel where I was treated by a very good doctor who gave me a quick course of medication. And as soon as the next morning, I was feeling pretty much back to normal. Panama is a fascinating country. It has a short but relatively turbulent history. Until 1903, it was part of Colombia. However, in 1903, it broke away and became an independent country. That happened as projects for the Panama Canal were gathering momentum. And that was only possible because the United States intervened militarily against Colombia and supported a homegrown Panamanian independence movement. Of course, the United States had its reasons, largely because it wanted to secure the rights needed to build what would become the Panama Canal. In the decades that followed, the relationship between Panama and the United States was complicated, to say the least. On the one hand, the United States was responsible for building the Panama Canal, which would transform Panama into one of the most economically successful countries in the region. On the other hand, that support was very conditional, the condition being that the United States would keep troops stationed in the canal zone just around the Panama Canal, right in the center of this newly independent country, and as well as that the United States would continue to interfere in Panamanian politics for years to come. What followed was years of coups, political instability, and tension with the United States, one of the most famous episodes of which was in the late 1980s when the United States invaded Panama in order to remove the military dictator Manuel Noriega. Eventually, control of the canal was transferred fully to Panama in 1999, giving the country complete sovereignty over one of its most important assets. Yet even today, Washington's influence in Panama remains unmistakable. Without the canal and the relationship that grew around it, Panama would be a very different country. American brands are everywhere. English is widely understood in certain sectors, and many aspects of daily life feel surprisingly North American. Even baseball, which is one of Panama's most popular sports, is a cultural import from the United States. That morning, I set out to explore Panama City. Walking through Panama City's glittering skyline, I eventually found myself inside one of the city's enormous shopping malls, where I felt spectacularly out of place. It was very much a case of the backpacker who doesn't wear Prada. Still, it served a purpose. It was there that I picked up my Panamanian SIM card and got myself connected again. That evening, I found a great place for dinner. It was this little hole-in-the-wall place just down the road from the hostel. It was run by a Cuban husband and wife duo. The pizzas were cheap, delicious, and exactly what I was looking for. The fact that it was close to the hostel was an added bonus because during the daytime, Panama City felt like quite a great city, but in the evening, it sort of felt a bit sketchy. The streets were full of people who looked like they'd rather be elsewhere, and I sort of, as I was walking around the streets at nighttime, I did feel like I was kind of being, observed or sized up a little bit. So it was great to find a dinner place that was just almost across the road from where I was staying. It was also at that pizza place that I learned something interesting about Panama's currency. Like Ecuador, Panama uses the US dollar. However, Panama also issues its own coins known as the Balboa, which circulate alongside US currency at the same value. What surprised me was discovering that some of the Ecuadorian coins that I still had in my wallet during my travels weren't accepted here. Although both countries use the US dollar system, their locally issued coins are different. You learn something new every day, and if you're learning something new from these videos, please consider giving this video a like, Subscribe to my channel and share my content on your social media. And if you really like what you're seeing, please tell your family and friends about it. It really means a lot to me and it helps me grow this YouTube channel. The next morning, it was time to head out to Panama City's foremost tourist attraction, the Panama Canal. To get there, the easiest way is by using Panama City's relatively new metro system. I took the metro all the way to Oldbrook Station at the western end of the line, which connects directly to the city's main bus terminal. From there, I hopped into a local bus bound for the Miraflores Locks, the most accessible and popular place to see the Panama Canal in action. Now, the Miraflores Locks aren't really a tourist attraction, but they are, right? So the Panama Canal was built initially just as a shipping lane. However, it's so famous it has become that, of course, it attracts tourists. So a grandstand and a theater have been built up to accommodate the tourists that come there and provide something for them to actually see, rather than just staring at a functioning canal. When you arrive, the visit begins in an IMAX theater, where you're shown a documentary about the construction and operation of the canal. The film was narrated by Morgan Freeman. It's very Hollywood, but it's also an excellent introduction to what you're about to see. Now, I'm not going to turn this into a whole history lesson, but it is fascinating to have a bit of understanding about how the whole thing was built. For centuries, world powers dreamed of finding a shortcut between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. The alternative was sailing all the way around Cape Horn at the southern tip of South America, a journey that added thousands of kilometers and weeks of travel time. The first serious attempt to build a canal through Panama was in the 1880s. It was pioneered by a French consortium, and the whole thing fell apart after a couple of years after the engineering challenges proved to be too much, and many of the team members succumbed to tropical illnesses such as yellow fever and malaria. The key problem was that Panama isn't flat. It actually has a mountain range running through the center of the country, and digging a sea-level channel through this mountain range would have required moving an unimaginable amount of earth. The breakthrough came in the American phase of the project, about 20 years after the French attempt. In 1905, a radically different solution was suggested. Instead of cutting a canal all the way through the mountains, it was proposed to dam the Chagres River in central Panama, flooding much of the central valley of the country to create a huge artificial lake, today known as Gatun Lake. Ships would then be lifted approximately 85 feet above sea level by a system of locks, cross the country on the lake and canal cuts, and then be lowered back down to sea level on the other side. It was an ingenious solution. Not only did it reduce the amount of earth that needed to be moved, but it was technically possible with the availability of engineering at that time. In addition, advances in medicine meant that malaria and yellow fever would be able to be controlled. Combined, these factors allowed the construction to proceed and ultimately led to the completion of one of the greatest engineering projects in human history. Standing there watching these gigantic ships rise and fall through the locks, it's difficult not to be impressed. Even more than a century later, the Panama Canal feels like a marvel of engineering and one of the defining achievements of the modern world. After the IMAX theater, you're led out onto the grandstands that overlook the locks. The whole experience feels very American. There's a commentator providing commentary live, almost as if you're watching a baseball game, explaining where each ship has come from, where it's headed, how much cargo it's carrying, and how the lock system works. Just east of the locks is a large holding area where the ships queue before entering. Vessels coming down from Gatun Lake and through the canal wait there until it's their turn to pass through the lock chambers. As they enter the locks, they're guided by small electronic locomotives that run along tracks on either side of the lock. Known as mules, these locomotives don't actually pull the ships forward, but instead they keep them centered and prevent them from drifting into the lock walls, while powerful tugboats and the ship's own engines provide the forward motion. Smaller vessels, meanwhile, are often guided through with ropes handled by lock workers, making for a very different sight from the giant container ships passing through. Once a ship enters the lock chamber, the massive gates close behind it. Water is then drained from the chamber, lowering the vessel by several meters. After about 10 minutes or so, once the water levels have equalized, the gates at the other end open and the ship proceeds into the next chamber, repeating the process until it reaches sea level. The Miraflores Locks aren't right on the Pacific coast, they're a couple of kilometers inland. However, from there you can see the ships heading their way further down the canal system at sea level towards the heads from where they head out into the vast Pacific Ocean. The scale of the ships coming through is incredible. One interesting thing about global shipping is that ships aren't just built to any size. If a vessel is going to transit major waterways like the Panama Canal or the Suez Canal, its dimensions need to fit within certain limits. For decades, the maximum size that could pass through the original Panama Canal was known as Panamax. Following the canal's major expansion in 2016, a new category known as Neo-Panamax was introduced, allowing significantly larger ships to use the waterway. Even so, the canal still places practical limits on how large ships can be built, and those limits continue to shape global maritime trade. Watching these massive ships pass through the Panama Canal was pretty impressive. One of the ships had come from Liberia on the coast of West Africa and then passed through the port of Cartagena in northern Colombia and was now on its way towards the east coast of South America. As they passed through, the crew on board the ship started waving at the spectators on the viewing platform, and everyone waved back. It felt strangely personal for something taking place on such a massive industrial scale. And standing there, watching ship after ship move between the two oceans, you understand why the Panama Canal is so important to this country. Every vessel that passes through pays significant tolls, generating billions of dollars in revenue, and making Panama one of the most prosperous countries in the region. And it also explains why Panama is such a multicultural society, because for over a century now, this canal has brought people, cultures, and businesses together from every corner of the globe, transforming Panama City into a vibrant multicultural hub. It was time to head back from the Panama Canal to Panama City, where I got back to my hostel and started chatting with the gentleman in the bunk just across from me. He was telling me about how he was originally from South America, but that he had been living in the United States for some time before he came to Panama. I asked him how long he'd been in Panama for, and he said that he'd been there for about 3 or 4 months because he had been deported from the United States. And then I decided not to really ask much more about why he'd been deported. So instead I sort of said, well, what are you doing in Panama? And he was like, well, you know, I sell things. And that answer was vague enough that I decided not to ask any more questions. The next morning I set out to explore Panama City properly. This city is a real melting pot. There are Chinese communities, Arab and Muslim communities, people from across Latin America, as well as large numbers of Americans, Europeans, and expatriates from all over the world. The canal has made the city a crossroads of global trade for more than a century, and you can really feel that in the diversity of the people who live here. I headed down to the old town known as Casco Viejo and immediately fell in love with it. It's a beautiful colonial quarter filled with churches, plazas, and colorful buildings and narrow streets. Although Panama City sits on the Pacific coast, the old town has a distinctly Caribbean feel to it. Walking around, I found myself imagining what the city might have looked like had the Panama Canal never been built. Before the skyscrapers, before the international banks, before Panama became one of the region's major commercial hubs. Instead, this city feels more like a window into another era. I've never been to Cuba, but it reminded me of how I imagine Havana might look. There were old churches, balconies overflowing with tropical plants, brightly colored facades, and a relaxed atmosphere that made it just a wonderful place to wander around. I just loved it, and I eventually made my way down to the waterfront at France Square, which is where you get one of the best skyline views in the city. From there you can see the contrast that defines Panama City, the old colonial town in one direction and the forest of modern skyscrapers in the other. Along the waterfront fence, couples had attached hundreds of padlocks as declarations of love. France Square itself is named in honor of the French engineers and investors who made the first serious attempt to build the Panama Canal before the project was ultimately completed by the Americans. That evening, I stopped by a small jewelry store and picked up the charm for my charm bracelet, which I would use to represent Panama, fittingly a ship's anchor. I also bought a slice of mamadiana cake, a traditional Panamanian cake made from cornmeal. It's nothing fancy, but with that, I would be able to celebrate the Panamanian edition of my 40th birthday. And then I got back to my hostel room and discovered that I had a new group of roommates. It was a bunch of young British tourists. They looked like they'd just graduated high school and were on their version of spring break or schoolies. And they had bought lots and lots of cheap Panamanian rum to celebrate their first evening in Panama City. I listened to them chanting, "Eating is cheating." I wondered if we were going to get any sleep at all. And then the deported gentleman in the bunk across from me finally snapped, and he screamed out, "Will you shut the fuck up? Some of us are trying to sleep." And then I knew that even though I had a whole bunch of unanswered questions about what he was doing in Panama, I knew that he had my back. Also that night, a Colombian friend of mine who I knew from Australia, Milene, was in Panama City as well. She was on her way back to Colombia and she was transiting through Panama City airport. We had been messaging back and forth about whether we'd be able to meet on her one night in Panama. However, Panama City is quite a long city and the airport was probably about 40 or 50 kilometers from where I was staying. She arrived at about 10 or 11 p.m. and had her connecting flight out at about 6 a.m. So unfortunately, although we were both in the same city on that night, we didn't get to catch up. Next morning, I headed back out to the Old Brook bus terminal and boarded a bus out towards Panama's second biggest city, David. David wasn't really a destination for me in Panama, it was more just a transit point onto my next country. And this is the thing, in Panama there are a lot of other things you can see. You can visit the beautiful Caribbean San Blas Islands, and you can also go up to Boquete, which is a mountaintop retreat full of cloud forests, hummingbirds and butterflies. However, for me, I was going to be seeing much more of that in my next country, so I continued on the bus over the Panama Canal and then traveled the 6 hours towards David, where I stayed in the Bamboo Hostel, run by a friendly former American soldier who had met his Panamanian wife during his time in the military and decided to settle down in Panama after leaving the service. That evening, I went to a cafe in a local hypermarket for a cheap dinner, and then the next morning, all I needed to do was wander the couple of blocks down to the Pan American Highway, flagged down a passing van, headed towards the Costa Rican border, and I was on my way out of Panama. And that's where I'm leaving things for this episode. I'm not doing a rapid fire round for every country that I visited in Central America. The countries tend to be quite small, and as well as that, I was traveling quite quickly. So instead, at the end of my time in Central America, I will do one big roundup of the best of Central America. In the next episode of Latin America Diaries, I will be heading on to one of the most vivid places that I visited in my entire trip, Costa Rica. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe, and I'll see you then.